I trusted Dr. Thorne. He was the best in the city. But when he called me for an emergency 8 p.m. appointment, I didn't realize the examination would have nothing to do with medicine. The city was a blur of rain and neon lights outside, but inside Dr. Eris Thorne's office, it was silent. It was 8 p.m. The receptionists had gone home, the lights in the waiting room were dimmed, and I was the only patient left. Dr. Thorne had called me personally, saying my last labs were inconclusive, and he needed to run a few more tests immediately. I'd been seeing Dr. Thorne for 3 years. He was the image of professionalism: silver hair, steady hands, and a voice that always sounded like he was in total control. But tonight, the air felt different. As I walked down the sterile hallway toward exam room 4, the sound of my own heels on the linoleum felt too loud. I changed into the paper gown, the thin material rustling with every breath. The room was cold. Then, the door opened. Dr. Thorne didn't enter with his usual clipboard-wielding haste. He moved slowly. He closed the door behind him, and for the first time in 3 years, I heard the heavy thud of the manual lock clicking into place. "I wanted to ensure we weren't disturbed," he said, his eyes scanning me with a clinical intensity that felt like it was burning through the paper gown. "Tonight we're going to be very thorough." He didn't start with the usual checks. He sat on the rolling stool and moved it until his knees were touching the exam table. He told me that modern medicine often ignores the neural pathways of pleasure and pain. He said he needed to check my sensitivity levels. He put on a pair of latex gloves. The sharp snap of the rubber against his wrist echoed in the quiet room. He began by tracing his fingers along my neck and shoulders. It was supposed to be a medical check, but the way he lingered, the way he watched my breathing hitch, told a different story. "Your pulse is elevated," he whispered, leaning in so close I could smell his peppermint breath and the sterile scent of soap. "Are you nervous? Or is it something else?" The clinical mask began to slip. He told me to lay back on the table. The fluorescent lights above me felt like an interrogation lamp. He explained that to get an accurate reading, he needed to bypass my mental defenses. The thumbnail moment. He reached out and pulled the paper gown down, exposing me to the cold air of the room. He didn't look away. "This is a private examination," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative growl. "Whatever happens in this room is strictly confidential." He moved to the end of the table, his hands firm and cold, and told me that the real test was about to begin. The immersive core, slow and heavy. The next 40 minutes of the script are a deep dive into the sensory experience of the exam table. The narrator should describe the contrast of the cold, sterile environment and the mounting heat of the encounter. Dr. Thorne abandoned the stethoscope. He became a man who had spent years repressed by his own professional mask, and now, with the doors locked, he was claiming his fee. He was methodical, just as he was in surgery, but with a raw hunger that left me breathless. He pushed me to the edge of the table, the metal cold against my skin, and showed me exactly what he meant by sensitivity. Every touch was a violation of the doctor-patient boundary, and every breath was a surrender. He whispered medical terms in my ear, words like arousal, response, and saturation, while he claimed me on that narrow table. By the time I was screaming, my voice muffled by the soundproof walls of the clinic, the city outside was long gone. There was only the heat, the latex, and the doctor who owned my secrets. The room returned to its sterile silence. Dr. Thorne stood up, peeled off his gloves, and tossed them into the biohazard bin with a practiced flick of the wrist. He adjusted his white coat and smoothed his hair in the mirror. In an instant, the predator was gone, and the respected physician was back. He sat at his desk and began writing on a prescription pad. "I'll see you in 2 weeks for a follow-up," he said, handing me the slip of paper. I looked at it. It wasn't a prescription for medicine. It was a note with a time and a private address. "Don't be late," he added, his eyes meeting mine one last time with a terrifying, silent promise. I walked out of the clinic, the cool night air hitting my face, realizing that I hadn't just gone for a checkup. I had been recruited into a world of shadows, and Dr. Thorne was the only one who had the cure. The prescription slip sat on my dashboard like a ticking bomb. The address wasn't in the medical district, it was a secluded estate tucked behind iron gates in the hills. 2 weeks had passed since the exam room, and I hadn't slept a full night since. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the snap of his latex gloves. I pulled up the winding driveway. The house was a masterpiece of glass and cold stone, perched on a cliffside. It looked exactly like Dr. Thorne, beautiful, expensive, and imposing. I wasn't there for a checkup. I was there because he had prescribed me to be there, and the fear of what he could do to my medical records or my reputation was the leash that pulled me to his door. The front door opened before I could even knock. Dr. Thorne stood there, but the white coat was gone. He wore a black turtleneck and tailored trousers. He looked younger, more dangerous. He didn't greet me like a patient. He didn't even say hello. He stepped aside, his eyes tracing the line of my throat. "You're 3 minutes late," he murmured. "In this house, we value precision." The door clicked shut, and the sound echoed through the high-ceilinged foyer. He led me through the house, showing me his private collection of antique medical instruments, silver scalpels and bone saws behind glass. He talked about the history of medicine, about how doctors used to have absolute power over their subjects. We ended up in his private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and a single plush velvet chair in the center. He sat at his desk and poured 2 glasses of dark wine. "The clinic is for the public, Leo," he said, using my name for the first time without the M's prefix. "This house is where I practice the true art of healing, and tonight your treatment enters its second phase." He told me to stand in the center of the room. He didn't touch me yet. He wanted to see how well I could follow instructions. He commanded me to describe in detail how I felt every hour since I left his clinic. He was analyzing my psychological state, breaking down my will with the same cold efficiency he used to diagnose a disease. The thumbnail moment. He stood up and walked behind me. I felt the heat of his body, but he stayed a hair's breadth away. He whispered that my recovery depended entirely on my level of compliance. He reached around and slowly began to unbutton my coat, his movements clinical and steady. "Do you want to be cured?" he asked against my ear. The power he held was intoxicating and terrifying. The immersive core, slow and intense. The next 40 minutes focus on the treatment in the study. Unlike the exam table, which was cold, this was a luxury of shadows and velvet. But the doctor's hands were just as demanding. He claimed me on that velvet chair, surrounded by the history of his profession. He wasn't just a man. He was a master who had diagnosed exactly what I was missing in my life. The need to be seen, to be taken, and to be dominated by someone who knew exactly where the nerves ended and the soul began. The narrator should describe the rhythmic intensity, the sound of the wine glasses vibrating on the desk, the heavy breathing that filled the library, and the way Thorne whispered that I was his most successful experiment. He pushed me to the edge of the chair, his grip like iron, and ensured that by the time I was cheming, I was calling him doctor, not out of habit, but out of absolute surrender. As the fire in the hearth died down, Thorne sat back at his desk, perfectly composed, as if the last hour hadn't happened. He opened a file on his laptop, my file. "Your health has never been better," he said, his voice returning to its professional hollow tone. He turned the screen toward me. It showed a legal document, a non-disclosure agreement, combined with a private care contract. He handed me a silver pen. "Sign this, and your medical bills disappear. Your records stay clean, and you return here every Tuesday night for your maintenance." I realized then that I was no longer a patient. I was a permanent part of his collection. I signed the paper, the ink drying like a blood oath. As I drove down the hill in the dark, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the lights of his estate. I wasn't going to a pharmacy for my next refill. I was going back to the man who owned my body.